everybody, and welcome back to the workshop. In today's episode, I'll be digging into my first Master Bladesmith knife build. I myself am a journeyman smith, which means that I'm not a Mastersmith yet, but my time is up. I will be able to test this year at the Blade Show in Atlanta in June to become a Mastersmith. And that is a two-part test you guys might remember from a while back. I did my performance test, which is where I took this knife, I chopped through a 2x4 twice, I cut a 1-inch thick free-hanging piece of rope, it's still shaved arm hair after all that, and then I put it in a bench vise and bent it 90 degrees, and I did that with my friends Steve Schwarzer and Jason Knight. That is the performance test. That's kind of the easy part. The hard part is building a set of 5 knives that have to be essentially aesthetically perfect. Obviously, aesthetics, design, function, all of that stuff is somewhat subjective in what different people like, but there's kind of a standard of like, yeah, this is a good, usable, really nice knife, or like, yeah, it looks good, but maybe it's not usable. Like maybe the ergonomics are bad, or maybe it looks good and the ergonomics are good, but some of the fit and finish is a little sketchy, where the guard fits up to the blade isn't quite right. Some of the facets or lines or plunge lines on it or something like that just don't quite add up. And any of those issues will get you failed from your Mastersmith test.
Stray but a little and it will fail.
The initial plan for this knife started about 4 years ago now, and it's been a lot of different influences from the work of old school bladesmiths to some traditional Indian influence from my time that I got to travel around India, as well as some influence from some of my favorite modern bladesmiths. But I brought it all together to make something that I think is very unique and very unique to my style. So the plan for this blade is to do a double lug, double edge, integral guard fighter. Now you'll notice that there's a section in both the handle and in the blade that has those little cross hatches going through it. Those areas are going to be completely pierced through. I'm going to remove all of that material. It'll be a window through the blade. That is something that I haven't really seen before, especially in the handle of a knife like this. I did it on a dagger before Blade Show last year as a little bit of a proof of concept, just to make sure that that concept would work out, that that fit up was going to be okay, and I was just absolutely tickled with the results. So we're going to be doing it again in a little bit different style. That dagger was all about symmetry. This one has a lot of symmetry, but not exactly in the same way. For now, we're going to get started on our Damascus pattern. This pattern is very close to a pattern that I saw on a gun barrel in India, which I have absolutely no idea how they were able to achieve this wonderful, mesmerizing pattern. Boggles my mind. Exceptional piece of craftsmanship, and I want to try and replicate that on this blade. So we're going to start off with 2 15-layer billets. One of them, we're going to call it billet A, will have more 15 and 20, which is our brighter steel in it, and the other one will have more darker steel, and that's so that when we combine them at the end, we'll have a contrast between light and dark, and it should look really nice. We're going to get both of those forge welded together, and while billet B is going to get drawn down and ready to be restacked back on up, billet A is just going to get forged down to being 700 thousandths of an inch square. That is just a little bit less than 3/4, and the reason why we're doing that is because the dies for my twisting machine fit that size bar, and so that's where we're going. So we're going to draw down billet A to 700 thousandths of an inch. We're going to cut it up into 8 equal pieces. We're going to cut billet B into 5 pieces. We will restack billet B, and we're going to twist billet A. Now, an important thing before you do any cutting on a billet like this is to do a stress relieving cycle. We call it normalization. You let it cool down a lot slower, annealing. The problem is that we didn't have time to do that. And just like sometimes it's hard to make time to stress relieve our billets, it's oftentimes hard to do stress relieving for ourselves, but it's a whole lot easier with the help of today's sponsor, BetterHelp. BetterHelp is an online service that helps connect you with qualified therapists that fit your needs. We're still in winter, which is oftentimes a lonely, dark season. A lot of people struggle with seasonal depression. And now we're rolling into Valentine's Day, which is an awfully rough season for quite a few folks. And having someone to be able to process through and talk about that stuff with is super important. That's where BetterHelp comes in. You don't have to go around and make appointments and find a local therapist. You can connect with someone online, and if it's not a good fit, it's super easy to change. I think it's super important that whoever's counseling you knows and shares your worldview. As a Christian, I absolutely need someone who understands the entire basis of my reality, the foundation of my worldview. And if you don't connect with that counselor or therapist that you initially start up with, it's very easy to change to someone else at no cost. And if you don't want to do a video call, they also do phone calls or even text messaging. I personally think that talking face-to-face via video call is the best way to do it, but that's just my own personal opinion. So if you're looking at taking that first step towards therapy, especially to find someone who understands and respects your faith, you can go to betterhelp.com/Will Stelter for 10% off your first month.
And the link is in the description down below. So thank you so much for BetterHelp for sponsoring today's episode. With that, let's keep on making Damascus.
We're going to do 4 of those billet A twisted bars to the right and 4 of them to the left. We're going to count the twists. We want these twists to line up as perfectly as possible because that'll give us a much nicer final pattern down the road, because we want those twists to line up and almost look like a mosaic piece of steel, when in reality that's very different from what we're doing. After billet B has been ground down and forge welded back together, we're going to draw it down to about 3/8 of an inch thick and then run it through the laddering dies in the Coal Iron Works forging press. This displaces those layers and gives it a bit of a serpentine look. And so we'll press it in and then take it over and grind off the highs of that pattern. And that means that our final layers that were straight before now zigzag back and forth. It's a very nice visual. Normally, people use the face of those bars as their pattern because it has kind of an elongated O's shape. But we're going to be using the edge grain of this bar for that kind of flowy pattern that it provides. With all of our twisted bars done, we're going to go ahead and re-square them back under the press. We're going to be forging in the highs, the ridges. It looks like threading on a bolt, but we want to bring it back to square. We're going to grind them off and do a test etch so that we can line up our pattern to make sure that everything is looking as nice as possible. Then we will forge weld 4 sets of those bars back together. We're then able to go and do what we call a re-square. The reason why we're doing that is because we're turning what is now the corners of this square into the flats of it. And this means that rather than that billet being cut in half where the top is right hand twist and the bottom is left hand twist, it now means that it's corner to corner. These are now triangles of steel. And the reason why we're doing this is because the next step is to stack these up in what we call a 4-way. So we're going to put them all together, but in between them, we're going to separate it out with that laddered bar. And so that means that these patterns are not going to be completely touching. They're going to have some separation. And the reason why I want to do that is, for one thing, it's part of the historical pattern, but even if it wasn't, it allows visually for you to see what's going to happen for the final step, and it's going to make it a lot more interesting to look at. So once we've got it separated out, now we can do our final forge weld with these 7 separate pieces. We'll forge weld that together, and this is our final forge weld of the whole process.
I think I got it pretty well stuck together. What I'm looking for right now is any dark spots on the billet, places that are cooling off faster than the rest. If it hadn't welded at one of the seams, there would probably be a dark line right there. We'll get a little bit better idea when we throw it back in the forge and see if one part heats up faster than the rest, but I don't think it's going to be a problem. All right, so as you guys saw in the last heat, the billet was getting a little bit sticky. That was from the flux that was on there. And this tiny little handle ain't really doing a whole lot to help it get it unstuck from the dies. Flux that I put on there helped melt away the forge scale in between the layers and help make sure that we get good welds. But when it melts, it turns into boratic glass, which has boratic acid in it. But that glass, when it comes in contact with the dies, cools down and gets real sticky. So for this next heat, I wanted to get that brushed off and cleaned off so it's easier to feed in. I think I'm just going to do 1 or 2 more passes before we start trying to twist it. My prediction is that it is going to go very poorly. Yep, okay. So all this is doing is biting in if we go higher up. Ugh. All right, I don't like how loose that twist is, so I'm going to untwist it. Can I do that? Yeah, that worked. And now I'm gonna try and twist it tighter if I can get, oh yeah, that'll work. Ah! So what I wanna do from here, I think, is flatten it back down, and that way I'll have something to grab in the jaws of the vise, and then I can do my twist back. We'll give that a shot. Yeah! Oh, no, we're rounding it out. Okay, so I'm gonna let it cool down real quick so we can grind on it. I didn't track which side of the bars were on which end. So on one side of them,
it's a slightly looser twist, and I would like for that to be the guard and handle because it just won't be as noticeable back there. But on the other hand, I kind of biffed this side. I have to weigh, do I think that the looser twist from our like corner pieces is going to be better at the tip because it's going to get distorted a lot there anyway, or do I want the kind of more biffed area to be the guard? I really don't know. I'm going to let it cool down, grind on it, and then make up my decision. The first step is to upset the butt end of the bar to make sure that I have enough material for the integral guard and the tang. After that, I start to isolate the tang area. This will let me draw out the lugs of the guard a lot easier. With that tang area whacked out, I now have something to hang on to, and I forged out the tip. It's a lot easier to do that now than when the billet is a lot thinner and wider. With the first guard lug forged out, I start shaping the bottom of the guard. This can need a little bit extra width to be able to forge out the smaller spinal lug. I rely very heavily on my 8-inch reed bench vise to do all of this. I use a lot of top tools in this process, and it really lets me have a good level of control over where the material moves, a lot more so than just swinging a hammer at it. With the guard roughly formed, I was able to move on to the blade. The stock for the blade was 3/4 of an inch thick by 1 1/4 inches wide, and I needed to get it down to about 2.5 inches wide at the widest part. I want to keep it nice and thick so I maintain a good weight even with the pierced out section. My final thickness should be around 300 thousandths of an inch, so I'd like to leave it a little under 400 thousandths final forged. Now, getting the shapes and all the lines was a challenge on this massive blade, but with a lot of time bouncing between my baby power hammer and a little crosspeen hammer, I got it there. I used a pair of Bladesmith calipers along the way to make sure that all of my dimensions worked out. All right, we've just encountered our first actual issue. Here on the guard, I was doing the last little tweak on it, and I'm noticing that there's a little bit of delamination happening there, which means that I'm going to fire the forge back up and try and reforge weld that back together. It's going to be weird because it's in a funky spot, but I'm going to get it screaming hot. We'll get some flux on there, probably some Iron Mountain flux because that'll really help hold it together. And yeah. So what I'm looking for as this heats up is to see if there's any dark spots on it. If one spot is heating up faster or slower than another chunk, especially in that area where I welded it. The other thing I'm looking for is to see if there's flux bubbling around the line. And I see the flux bubbling in the area that it may be welded at, but I don't see any dark spots, which is good. That makes any sense. All right, I'm pretty tickled with how this came out. This is not an easy forging to do. Normal knife forging is fairly simple. Forging an integral bolster chef's knife is a little bit more complex, especially one that has good proportions and has the heel come straight down from the bolster. This is like actual blacksmithing. Massive changes in dimension, weird different cross sections. All of that stuff makes it a lot more difficult to manage because the end of the guard is going to cool down way faster than the body of the guard, and just everything that comes into play makes this a very difficult forging. But I'm very excited with where we ended on it. It's going to be a huge challenge to get it to where it needs to be, honestly. Everything needs to be square. It needs to look good. It needs to be perfect, basically. And I hope I'm up to the challenge, but we'll see how it goes. Next episode, we'll get started on the softening process to make sure that this is nice to machine on before we get on to the rest of the finishing out that we'll be doing. This is going to be probably the craziest, most challenging knife. The dagger will probably be a big challenge as well, but this is totally out of my wheelhouse. I haven't done anything quite like this before. That little dagger that was kind of the initial concept for this was definitely a lot easier than this is going to be. So thank you so much to BetterHelp for sponsoring this episode. Thank you to our patrons for supporting us, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Bye-bye.